The failure to acknowledge or repent or discuss the history of the communist past weighs like a stone on many of the nations of post communist Europe. Whispered rumors about the contents of old secret files continue to disrupt contemporary politics, destabilizing at least one Polish and one Hungarian prime minister. Deals done in the past between fraternal communist parties continue to have ramifications in the present. In many places, the secret police apparatus, the cadres, the equipment, the offices remains virtually unchanged. The occasional discovery of fresh caches of bones can suddenly spark controversy and anger. This past weighs on Russia most heavily of all. Russia inherited the trappings of Soviet power and also the Soviet Union's great power complex, its military establishment, and its imperial goals. As a result, the political consequences of absent memory in Russia have been much more damaging than they have in other former communist countries. Acting in the name of the Soviet motherland, Stalin deported the Chechen nation to the wastes of Kazakhstan, where half of them died and the rest were meant to disappear, along with their language and culture. 50 years later, in a repeat performance, the Russian Federation obliterated the Chechen capital, Grozny, and murdered tens of thousands of Chechen civilians in the course of two wars. If the Russian people and the Russian elite remembered, viscerally, emotionally remembered, what Stalin did to the Chechens, they could not have invaded Chechnya in the 1990s, not once and not twice. To do so was the moral equivalent of post war Germany invading Western Poland. Very few Russians saw it that way, which is itself evidence of how little they know about their own history. There have also been consequences for the formation of Russian civil society and for the development of the rule of law. To put it bluntly, if scoundrels of the old regime go unpunished, good will in no way have been seen to triumph over evil. This may sound apocalyptic, but it is not politically irrelevant. The police do not need to catch all the criminals all of the time for most people to submit to public order, but they need to catch a significant proportion. Nothing encourages lawlessness more than the sight of villains getting away with it, living off their spoils, and laughing in the public's face. The secret police kept their apartments, their dachas, and their large pensions. Their victims remained poor and marginal. To most Russians, it now seems as if the more you collaborated in the past, the wiser you were. By analogy, the more you cheat and lie in the present, the wiser you are. In a very deep sense, some of the ideology of the Gulag also survives in the attitudes and worldview of the new Russian elite. I once happened to listen in on a classic late night Russian kitchen table conversation which took place in the home of some Moscow friends. At a certain point, very late in the evening, two of the participants, successful entrepreneurs, began to argue. Just how stupid and just how gullible are the Russian people, and just how much more intelligent are we? The old Stalinist division between categories of humanity, between the all powerful elite and the worthless enemies, lives on in the new Russian elite's arrogant contempt for its fellow citizens. Unless that elite soon comes to recognize the value and the importance of all of Russia's citizens, to honor both their civil and their human rights, Russia is ultimately fated to become the Zaire of the North, a land populated by impoverished peasants and billionaire politicians who keep their assets in Swiss bank vaults and their private jets on runways engines running. Tragically, Russia's lack of interest in its past has deprived the Russians of heroes as well as victims. The names of those who secretly opposed Stalin, however ineffectively, the students like Susanna Petsora, Viktor Bulgakov, and Anatoly Zigulin, the leaders of the Gulag rebellions and uprisings, the dissidents from Zakharov to Bukovsky to Orlov, ought to be as widely known in Russia as are in Germany the names of the participants in the plot to kill Hitler. The incredibly rich body of Russian survivors' literature, tales of people whose humanity triumphed over the horrifying conditions of the Soviet concentration camps, should be better read, better known, more frequently quoted. If school children knew these heroes and their stories better, they would find something to be proud of, even in Russia's Soviet past, aside from imperial and military triumphs. Yet, the failure to remember has more mundane, practical consequences too. It can be argued, for example, that Russia's failure to delve properly into the past also explains its insensitivity to certain kinds of censorship and to the continued heavy presence of secret police, now renamed the Federalnaya Служба Безопасности or FSB. Most Russians are not especially bothered by the FSB's ability to open mail, tap telephones, and enter private residences without a court order. Nor are they much interested, for example, in the FSB's long prosecution of Alexander Nikitin, an ecologist who wrote about the damage Russia's northern fleet is doing to the Baltic Sea. Insensitivity to the past also helps explain the absence of judicial and prison reform. In 1998, I paid a visit to the central prison in the city of Arkhangelsk. Once one of the capital cities of the Gulag, Arkhangelsk lay directly on the route to Solovetsky, to Kotlas, to Kargopolag, and to other northern complexes. The city prison, which dated back to before Stalin's time, seemed hardly to have changed since then. I entered it in the company of Galina Dudina, a woman who qualifies as a genuine post Soviet rarity, a prisoner's rights advocate. As we walked the halls of the stone building, accompanied by a silent warder, it seemed if we had stepped back into the past. The corridors were narrow and dark, with damp, slimy walls. When the warder opened the door to a men's cell, I caught a glimpse of naked bodies stretched out on banks covered in tattoos. Seeing the men were undressed, he quickly closed the door and allowed them to compose themselves. Opening it again, I walked in to see about 20 men standing in a row, not at all pleased to have been interrupted. They offered mumbled monosyllabic answers to the questions put to them by Galina and mostly stared hard at the cement floor of their cell. They had, it seemed, been playing cards. The warder led us quickly away. We spent more time in the woman's cell. In the corner there stood a toilet. Other than that, the scene could have been drawn straight from the pages of a 1930s memoir. Women's underwear hung from a rope strung across the ceiling. The air was thick and close, very hot, and heavy with the smell of perspiration, bad food, damp, and human waste. The women, also half dressed, sat on banks around the room and showered insults on the warder, shrieking their demands and complaints. It was as if I had walked into the cell that Olga Adamova Slyosberg had entered in 1938. I repeat again her description. The arched walls were dripping on either side, leaving only a narrow passage between them were low continuous bedboards packed with bodies. Assorted rags were drying on lines overhead. The air was thick with the foul smoke of strong cheap tobacco and loud with arguments, shouts, and sobs. Next door, in the juvenile cell, there were fewer prisoners but sadder faces. Galina handed a handkerchief to a sobbing 15-year-old girl who had been accused of stealing the ruble equivalent of $10. There now, she said. You keep working on your algebra and you'll be out of here soon. Or so she hoped. Galina met many people who had been imprisoned for months without a trial, and this girl had only been in gaol for a week.